The Intergalactic Council convened, a grand assembly of species whose existence stretched back millions of years. In the central hall, alien representatives of all forms and sizes filled the tiered seats, their colors and shapes blending into a tapestry of interstellar life. Each one bore the distinct markings of its culture and origin, displaying the pride of their ancient lineages. The air thrummed with the gravity of this gathering. Something serious had happened. A Zithian envoy, tall and shimmering with scales that reflected starlight, initiated the discussion. "It appears we have encountered a unique anomaly with the humans," he began, his voice a melodic hum resonating through the chamber. A low murmur spread across the council. The humans were a new addition to the council's ranks, and, in many ways, a mystery. But this was no ordinary concern. Several council members glanced at each other, and whispers spread, curious and cautious. A representative from the Jathari, a race known for their strict adherence to warfare protocols, raised her slim, translucent limb. Last cycle, a human fleet engaged with the Oranthi raiders. They were outnumbered tenfold. Any logical species would surrender. Her voice trembled, half in frustration and half in confusion. Instead, they fought to the last ship. Even when their defeat was certain, they showed no intention of yielding. Another council member, a feathered Adraxian with vibrant emerald plumage, clucked in disbelief. "Our scouts have observed this behavior across several engagements. Their fleets, their soldiers, even individual civilians. There's no clear surrender protocol. It's as if they lack a basic survival instinct." The Oranthi delegate, a creature with a long, sinuous body covered in dark chitin, hissed in agreement. "In all my cycles, I have never seen anything like it. We offered them the ceremonial signs of submission, yet they continued." One of their commanders even laughed in response. A ripple of incredulity swept through the council. Every species present adhered to strict rules of engagement. Wars were common but orderly. Surrender was a time-honored practice that had saved lives for eons. But these humans, these stubborn, reckless humans, did not seem to follow any of these time-tested norms. They fought until the bitter end, no matter the odds. The Crithian representative, an elder with shimmering silver scales and eyes that reflected ancient wisdom, leaned forward, addressing the assembly with a serious tone. "Perhaps they are a warrior species with an unbreakable code of honor, even in defeat?" The Zithian envoy shook his head, exasperated. "No, we've studied their culture. They do have military structures, but their history reveals a mix of diplomacy and conflict with an odd array of individualist behavior. Even in battle, they do not fall into patterns we can recognize. They seem unpredictable." There was a brief silence as this observation sank in. Finally, the representative of the Takora, a massive, armored being with two deep-set eyes glowing faintly blue, boomed. "Perhaps they simply don't understand the concept. Could they lack the comprehension of surrender?" A burst of laughter erupted from the Tegan delegate, a small, light-bodied creature known for its wit. "Or perhaps they just lack the good sense to know when they're beaten." This broke the tension, and several members chuckled, albeit nervously. The humans' persistence was baffling, almost amusing, but also unsettling. They knew so little about the species that had so recently joined the Council's ranks. Yet here were accounts of humans defying the Council's most basic expectations about survival and surrender. A representative from the Githra, a soft-skinned, amorphous being with a calm and meditative aura, raised her voice gently. "We cannot ignore this. If humans refuse to submit, even in the face of absolute defeat, they could become a destabilizing force in council affairs." The Zithian envoy, his shimmering scales now dulled in worry, cleared his throat. "Then it's decided. We must understand this anomaly. A formal envoy will be dispatched to Earth. They must explain their surrender protocols, if they exist at all. This council must understand how to deal with such unpredictable allies." Nods and murmurs of agreement filled the hall. The council's decision was final. The alien envoy, a tall, glimmering figure with scales that caught and reflected the stars, was filled with a sense of both pride and mission as his ship descended towards Earth. He had been chosen for this task because of his long experience and meticulous nature. As he made his way through the atmosphere, he reviewed his expectations. A formal meeting, clear explanations, and if all went well, a straightforward documentation of humanity's surrender protocols. He'd even prepared a list of questions, confident that the answers would resolve the Council's concerns. The shuttle landed, and the envoy adjusted his ceremonial robe, preparing to meet Earth's dignitaries. But instead of an ornate reception or an entourage of high-ranking officials, he was greeted by a single human. The man wore a slightly wrinkled uniform, looked tired, and gave him a casual wave. The envoy blinked, uncertain if this was some prelude to the official meeting. "Hey there, name's Jim. Welcome to Earth." The human extended a hand, an odd gesture, but the envoy had read about human customs and reached out to shake it. "Thank you," the envoy replied, his voice polite but bewildered. "I am here to discuss humanity's surrender protocols. My council has observed anomalies in your behavior during combat situations. I am here to understand your official procedures for surrender." Jim tilted his head, his brow furrowing. Surrender protocols? Official procedures? I mean, we don't really have one." The envoy blinked, caught off guard. Every species has surrender protocols, rules, gestures, or phrases to signify a cessation of resistance when defeat is imminent. Surely you must have a standardized response to avoid unnecessary loss. Jim chuckled, scratching his head. "Well, not exactly. I guess we just fight till we can't anymore, and then maybe retreat if things get real bad. Or we dig in and try again. But surrendering, like, officially? Nah, not really our style." The envoy processed this, his analytical mind attempting to rationalize what he was hearing. "So, you simply persist until victory or destruction. How is this? How do your people know when to cease hostilities? Is there no protocol at all?" Jim laughed, shaking his head. "Look, buddy, I think you're looking at this all wrong. We don't have a set of rules for throwing in the towel. Some of us just don't know when to quit. And the ones who do, well, even they might get a second wind." He looked at the envoy, whose confused expression had deepened. "It's kind of like a game, you know. You keep trying till the last second, just to see if maybe, just maybe, you'll win." The envoy frowned, his frustration building. "That sounds irrational. In the Council, every species understands the necessity of avoiding futile destruction. There are formal gestures, ceremonies. But you seem to consider surrender as some kind of insult." Jim nodded, grinning. "Yeah, that sounds about right. Surrendering's not exactly in our nature. If we think there's a slim chance, we'll go for it. Besides, some of us actually think it's kind of fun to see how far we can push our luck." The envoy's eyes narrowed, his scales darkening in agitation. "So you simply persist, without regard for the strategic outcomes or probability of success. You risk annihilation on a whim." Whim might be a strong word," Jim replied, chuckling again. "It's more like, well, you never know until you try. And even if it looks bad, you've still got a chance, right? That's the human spirit. Who knows? Maybe something good will happen if you keep going." The envoy's frustration deepened as he tried to make sense of this baffling ideology. "This spirit you speak of defies the principles of survival. We maintain surrender protocols precisely to prevent unnecessary destruction." Jim shrugged. "Different strokes for different folks, I guess. Look, if you're trying to get a neat, tidy answer on surrender protocols, I'm afraid you're out of luck." Taking a deep breath, the envoy composed himself, sensing that perhaps observation would be more enlightening than discussion. "Very well. I request permission to observe human behavior in scenarios where other species might surrender. Perhaps this will shed light on the nature of your persistence." Jim smirked, giving the alien a pat on the shoulder. "Oh, you're in for a treat, my friend. you'll see that we're a little more complicated than a protocol. The alien envoy stood on the sidelines, observing the human military training grounds with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. Soldiers ran through grueling obstacle courses, crawling through mud, scaling walls, and dragging heavy loads across rocky terrain. Some collapsed from exhaustion, only to be pushed by their comrades to get up and keep going. The envoy watched with disbelief as they pressed on, sweat pouring, eyes narrowed in determination. Turning to Jim, the human who had been his guide, the envoy asked, "Are these simulations truly necessary? Other species do not subject their soldiers to such extremes. A well-prepared soldier should not require this level of punishment." Jim grinned. "Oh, this is just basic training. Gotta make sure they can handle the worst conditions. They push themselves to see how far they can go before they break." "But why?" the envoy asked, bewildered. "Surely there's no tactical advantage to such a suffering." Jim shrugged. "It's about resilience. A human soldier needs to know that, no matter what they're up against, they can keep going. Sometimes it's not about winning. It's about surviving until the tide turns." The envoy fell silent, struggling to comprehend this mindset. In the council, every species knew when to retreat, when to yield in order to minimize losses. This notion of enduring simply for the sake of enduring was alien to him, yet the humans seemed to embrace it as an essential part of their identity. Later, the envoy accompanied Jim to a local hiking trail, where a distress call had come through about an injured hiker. They found a young woman, battered and visibly exhausted, with a sprained ankle that should have left her immobile. But instead of waiting for help, she had already fashioned a makeshift splint from branches and cloth, hobbling down the trail on her own. The envoy stared, bewildered. Why did she not wait for assistance? Jim chuckled, watching her determined shuffle down the path. Humans don't like waiting around when they can take action. She's probably thinking she'd rather get herself down the mountain than sit around feeling helpless. "But she's risking further injury," the envoy countered, his disbelief growing. "Any logical being would understand that waiting is the safest option." Jim nodded, as if the envoy had pointed out something obvious. "That's the thing. Humans aren't always logical, especially when it comes to challenges. Sometimes, even if it doesn't make sense, we'd rather go through a bit of pain than admit we need help." The envoy couldn't respond. In every species he'd encountered, survival and self-preservation were paramount. And yet, here was a species that seemed to thrive on defying that instinct. As the days went on, the envoy continued to witness countless small examples of this unrelenting persistence in humans, not just in extreme circumstances, but even in daily life. He watched construction workers laboring through storms, their soaked clothes clinging to them as they refused to halt their work. Office workers slogged through endless hours to meet deadlines, staying well past exhaustion. They seemed to possess a relentless drive, an energy that bordered on irrational. Then, the envoy was called to observe a search and rescue mission. A team of volunteers had gathered to help locate a group of missing children who had wandered off during a camping trip. Night had fallen, and temperatures were plummeting, yet the searchers refused to rest, pressing into the darkness despite exhaustion and the cold. Some had been searching for hours, their faces lined with fatigue, but not one of them considered giving up. The envoy could see it in their eyes, the utter refusal to accept defeat, even when the situation seemed increasingly grim. When he expressed his confusion, Jim explained simply, "When lives are on the line, quitting isn't an option. Doesn't matter if we're tired or if the odds are against us. We keep going." The envoy fell silent, watching the volunteers as they rallied, calling each other's names in encouragement. This was no formal battle, no grand war, yet these humans displayed a courage he had rarely seen even in the most hardened soldiers. And they did it not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something ingrained in their core. Finally, as dawn approached, the missing children were found, shivering but unharmed. The rescuers embraced them, some with tears in their eyes, relief etched into their faces. The envoy stared at them in awe, his understanding of humanity's essence shifting. To humans, surrender was not an option unless there was no other choice. Giving up was a last resort, something to be avoided at all costs. He realized that they seemed to thrive on adversity, as if struggle itself fueled their spirit. What had once seemed irrational now held a strange logic. Humans didn't endure simply out of stubbornness. They endured because they believed, against all odds, that victory or survival could always be wrestled from the jaws of defeat. The envoy found himself moved, filled with a growing respect for this fierce resilience. He could see now that surrender was not just a tactic to them. It was something they viewed with near disdain. To them, life was not a matter of accepting limits, but of testing them, challenging the impossible simply because it might be possible after all. As the envoy watched them, he began to understand that, in the face of the unknown, humans would push forward, driven by something far stronger than protocol or logic. They were compelled by hope, by the possibility of triumph, and by a resolve that went beyond survival. A resolve that sought meaning, that found purpose in every battle, every struggle, and every refusal to give in. The envoy stood before the assembled council, a ripple of anticipation stirring through the vast hall. His once gleaming scales had dimmed, evidence of the weight he now carried after his observations on Earth. Every representative, every species waited in silence, eager to understand the envoy's findings. He cleared his throat, his voice calm but laden with a reverence he hadn't expected to feel. Honored members of the council, he began, I have returned with observations that defy our understanding of standard conflict behavior. Humanity does not conform to any established protocols we have documented among the known species. A murmur spread through the council, with the Oranthi representative leaning forward in intrigue and the Adraxian tapping their claws impatiently. The envoy took a breath, organizing his thoughts before continuing. On Earth, I observed that in both controlled training exercises and real crises, humans reject surrender as a concept unless they face absolute annihilation. They do not respond to overwhelming odds as others do. When defeat seems imminent, they persist. Where we would expect resignation, they demonstrate a level of resilience that, by all logic, borders on irrationality. The Jathari representative raised a slender limb, signaling to speak. Are they unaware of the costs associated with such behavior? Surely they understand that refusing surrender leads to unnecessary losses. The envoy shook his head. They are aware. It is not a lack of comprehension, but a deeply ingrained belief that retreat is only acceptable in the rarest of circumstances. Humans appear to view surrender as a loss of self, not merely a tactical decision. Even in mundane situations, their instinct is to endure, to adapt, even if adaptation means suffering. The Krithian elder tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. You're saying they would rather suffer defeat than submit? That their pride or stubbornness prevents them from accepting when they are beaten? The envoy paused, searching for the right words. It goes beyond pride or stubbornness. They see struggle as a fundamental part of existence. Even when faced with situations where surrender is the most logical option, they choose to continue, holding on to hope, even if hope itself seems irrational. I witnessed a search and rescue operation where civilians, with no reward in sight, risked their lives for others simply because they could not bear to leave the task unfinished. The Tegan representative, who had initially laughed at the idea of human persistence, now looked serious. So, they are motivated by hope, even when hope is objectively unreasonable. Yes, the envoy nodded. In situations where any other species would assess the probabilities and decide that surrender is the best course, humans press forward. They act as if the smallest possibility of success is worth the risk, as if the very act of striving itself holds meaning. There was silence as the council absorbed this. Some members exchanged glances, astonished, while others looked visibly unsettled. The Githra representative, a being of calm, meditative wisdom, finally spoke. This is a troubling revelation. If they refused to accept defeat even in dire circumstances, humanity could destabilize alliances, provoke unnecessary conflict. The envoy inclined his head. Indeed, that is one potential outcome. But I would also note their loyalty to one another and to those who stand by them. I believe their tenacity is not solely driven by pride, but also by a sense of duty to their allies. I observe humans risking everything, not for glory or gain, but because they could not bear to abandon one another. The Adraxian representative let out a low trill of approval. Such loyalty could be advantageous if harnessed. A species that refuses to surrender, that values loyalty above self-preservation. They could be a formidable ally, but others were unconvinced. The Takora delegate rumbled, his deep-set eyes flickering with skepticism. Or a liability. How can we trust a species that doesn't know when to yield? Their unpredictability could lead them to drag allies into reckless situations. A lively debate erupted among the council members. Some argued that humanity's refusal to back down could make them an asset, especially in situations where others would falter. Others contended that such recklessness would inevitably lead to disastrous outcomes. The envoy watched, noting how the council's divided opinions mirrored his own mixed feelings. Finally, the Zithian envoy cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "There is a proposal on the table," he said, voice steady. Some members suggest that humanity be reclassified as a high-risk species due to their refusal to conform to conventional surrender protocols. This would mean a greater level of surveillance and, if necessary, containment of their influence within the Council's affairs. The Oranthi delegate interjected, their tone unusually pensive. But consider the other side of this. If we classify them as high-risk, we may alienate them. They are new to intergalactic diplomacy and may not take well to containment. If their loyalty is as strong as the envoy claims, they may become valuable allies in times of crisis. More murmurs echoed through the chamber as council members weighed the benefits and risks. Humanity was unpredictable, yes, but their persistence, their loyalty, it was rare and possibly invaluable. The debate continued, with voices rising and falling, opinions shifting in a delicate balance. In the end, the Crithian elder raised his hand, silencing the assembly, his eyes fixed on the envoy with a penetrating gaze. "We have heard enough. Humanity's resolve may be foreign to us, but that does not mean it is without merit. The Council will not attempt to force conformity upon them. They will be monitored, but as equals, not as a risk to be contained." The Council members nodded, some reluctantly, others with satisfaction. The resolution was set. The envoy, feeling a strange sense of relief, realized he had come to understand humanity more deeply than he'd anticipated. Their stubbornness was not something to suppress. It was a force that demanded respect, something raw and unbreakable. As the council adjourned, the envoy reflected on his journey to Earth, on the baffling tenacity he had witnessed. Humans would never follow the standard path, never yield to protocols or probabilities as other species did. But perhaps, he thought with a faint sense of admiration, that was precisely why they were worth watching. Back on Earth, the envoy stood in the quiet of dawn, his gaze sweeping over the city that had become familiar to him. His initial sense of bewilderment had faded, replaced now by something closer to respect, an admiration he could scarcely explain. Humans were unlike any species he had encountered, and despite his original assignment to observe and report, he found himself reluctant to leave. Perhaps, he mused, he hadn't yet uncovered the full depths of their spirit. He decided quietly to remain. The council would expect regular reports, but he wanted to study humanity more closely, to understand the nuances of their nature that had proven so unpredictable yet so profound. Observing from afar had shown him their resilience. Now, he wanted to experience it firsthand. It wasn't long before he had an opportunity. A sudden flood struck the outskirts of the city where he was staying. Waters rose quickly, catching residents by surprise. The envoy watched from a distance as chaos erupted. Alarms blared. Streets were evacuated, and the sound of helicopter blades cut through the storm. The humans' response was immediate, a rapid mobilization that astonished him. Civilians, rescue teams, and even local officials rushed toward the flooded areas rather than retreating to safety. His curiosity piqued. The envoy joined them, following as closely as he could to observe how they faced such a crisis. He found himself surrounded by a team of volunteers assembling a makeshift dam of sandbags to divert the water. Some were shivering, soaked to the bone, but none showed any intention of stopping. An older woman handed him a shovel with a firm nod, urging him to join in. Bemused but willing, he took it, working alongside them, feeling for the first time the tangible energy of their resolve. They fought the waters with a singular purpose, directing their efforts with barely a word spoken. They did not simply react. They anticipated, adapted, adjusted, all while keeping each other's spirits high with laughter and encouragement. At one point, a man beside him stumbled, his legs nearly giving way. The envoy moved to assist, but before he could, two others had already stepped in, helping the man to his feet, patting him on the back as he steadied himself and resumed his work. The envoy felt a strange swell of emotion, realizing that these humans seemed bound to each other by something far stronger than protocol or duty. It was as if, in their own minds, failure was an unacceptable option as long as there was a chance, even the smallest chance, of success. As the crisis subsided and the waters began to recede, the envoy stood among them, drenched and exhausted but filled with a sense of awe. In the hours of struggle, he had seen what he could only describe as an unyielding spirit, a unity that defied his previous understanding. These humans would not surrender, not to floods, not to despair. Their resilience was not about pride or stubbornness. It was, he realized, the essence of who they were. Later, as he composed his report, he tried to find words for what he had experienced. He sent a brief transmission back to the council, capturing the events he had witnessed. The council's response was swift, a formal acknowledgement of his report and a resolution regarding humanity's official classification. They would be designated a tenacious species. Other species were advised to approach humanity with caution, for any conflict with them would not end through traditional means. A formal note stated that unless victory is absolute, direct confrontation with humanity is ill-advised. It was a sober acknowledgement that humans, in their refusal to yield, were a force to be reckoned with. The envoy smiled as he read the message, feeling an odd satisfaction. The council had come to understand, as he had, that humanity's strength lay in its tenacity. They would not be contained, nor would they easily conform to protocols crafted by species that could not fathom their spirit. Reflecting on his own journey, the envoy knew he would continue his study of humans, but not as an outsider. He felt something shift within him, a recognition that he had, in some way, become part of their world. The flood had shown him that there was much to admire about them, and perhaps even more to learn. As the days went on, he found himself blending into the rhythm of life on Earth. He watched humans with a new appreciation, seeing in their everyday actions the echoes of the same resilience that had baffled him at first. Whether it was a worker laboring late into the night, the runner training through exhaustion, or the rescue volunteer braving danger, he saw a unity of spirit that went beyond survival. It was a collective will, something fierce and beautiful that he couldn't help but respect. In his final report to the council, he ended with a simple reflection. Humanity's strength lies in its refusal to accept limitations as final. To confront them is to confront the limitless nature of their resolve. They do not bend easily, and in this defiance, they find purpose. To them, existence is not simply to endure but to strive, no matter the odds. With a sense of quiet satisfaction, the envoy closed his transmission. As he looked out over the city, he felt pride, not for himself, but for these beings who had shown him what it meant to live without surrender. The humans, he realized, were indeed remarkable, not in spite of their resistance to conformity, but because of it.